I never thought a coffee spill could change anything. It was the kind of Tuesday that smells faintly of oil and dust in the corner repair shop where I'd been working for a few months. I was leaning over the counter, wiping grease off my hands, when she walked in. Not like someone who belonged in a shop full of engines and broken radios, but someone who owned the air she moved through. Mid-40s, sharp eyes, hair that caught the light in copper threads, and a suit that said she didn't need to be here, but maybe she wanted to. I froze for a second, which wasn't like me, because I usually don't freeze for anyone. She smiled at the mechanic behind the counter, but then, unexpectedly, her gaze flicked to me, just for a moment, long enough to make my stomach stumble. "Can you help me with this?" she asked, holding a small, battered radio. Her voice was calm, deliberate, with the kind of rhythm that makes you notice each word. I nodded, trying not to sound like an idiot. Yeah? Sure," I said. "Bring it over here." The way she handled the radio, it wasn't carelessness, but it wasn't delicate either. Made me want to tell her she'd break it if she wasn't careful. But I didn't. I smiled instead. While I was poking around inside the radio, she leaned on the counter a little, just enough for me to notice. There was a subtle tension in the air, like we were both trying not to measure each other, but couldn't help it. Every time I glanced up, she was watching, just watching, with that quiet curiosity that made me feel like she could see all the corners of me I usually kept hidden. And then it happened. A drip of coffee from her cup, barely noticeable, slid across the counter and onto my hand. I flinched. She blinked. "Oh, sorry," she murmured, more surprised than apologetic. I tried to brush it off, but she quickly grabbed a napkin herself and dabbed at my hand. "Here," she said, and for a second, her fingers brushed mine. Not enough to be scandalous, but enough to leave me aware of every nerve ending in my arm. I jerked back slightly, and she didn't pull away, just tilted her head like it wasn't awkward at all. I wanted to say something clever, or at least something normal, but instead I laughed nervously. "It's fine," I said. "Really. But the truth? I didn't want it to be fine." We fell into a strange rhythm after that. She talking about the radio, me half listening, half watching. I noticed how she twisted the napkin between her fingers when she thought no one was looking. How she tapped her pen softly against the counter when she was waiting. How she laughed quietly at nothing at all, and the sound lingered in the small space longer than it should. Before she left, she straightened her coat, looked at me, and said, "Thanks. I'll let you know if it works." Then she was gone. I stayed behind the counter, heart still hammering, staring at the spot where she had stood. I kept thinking about the briefest brush of her fingers, about the tilt of her head, about the way she seemed entirely confident, entirely untouchable, and yet, maybe, somehow, noticing me. And the thought that wouldn't leave me. She could have dismissed me in a heartbeat. But instead, she didn't. She left a trace, one I couldn't stop tracing in my mind, even as the smell of coffee and motor oil hung thick around me. It was 2 days later when she came back. Same radio, same quiet confidence, same impossible air about her that made the shop feel smaller and louder at once. This time, I was ready, or so I thought. She leaned over the counter with that same posture that made her look both in control and tired. Maybe it was the crease at the corner of her eyes, or the way her hands hovered over the radio like they were afraid to make a mistake. "Still not working," she said, but her voice had a tremor I didn't expect. Something in it made me want to step closer, even though I knew I shouldn't. "Let me take another look," I said, trying for casual, but my hands were already itching to touch the radio, to fix it, to do something. She watched me carefully, not saying anything, and I realized she was holding back. Maybe she always did. Her guardedness was like a wall I didn't know if I could climb, but the gaps, the tiny cracks, were mesmerizing. As I worked, I stole glances at her hands. They were elegant in a deliberate, careful way, and the faint calluses on her fingertips hinted at a life that didn't just float through meetings and coffee breaks. Her nails were clean, trimmed, and almost painfully meticulous. I wondered if she ever let them get messy just for herself. She sighed softly, and it was like a ripple in the air, subtle but noticeable. I didn't need her to say anything. The line of tension across her shoulders, the slow blink of her tired eyes, the way she fiddled with the pen in her pocket. They all spoke louder than words. "You don't have to keep this up," I said quietly, not sure why the word slipped out. She blinked, her lips parting slightly, and for a moment she seemed caught off guard, as if she'd forgotten someone could see her at all. I just, she started, and then stopped. She shook her head, a tiny, almost invisible gesture, and laughed softly. It wasn't full, easy laughter. It was caught somewhere between amusement and something heavier, maybe exhaustion. I noticed the small exhale she didn't quite release, the way her shoulders slumped a fraction when she thought I wasn't watching. I wanted to reach out, to do something, but the rules of whatever strange boundary she had set made me hesitate. Finally, she leaned closer to inspect the radio, and our arms brushed. Again, not enough to startle anyone else, but enough to make my chest tighten. She didn't pull back. Not immediately. She stayed close, just long enough for the warmth of her hand near mine to linger in the air between us. "I think it might work now," she said, almost a whisper, almost an apology. Her eyes flicked up at mine for a fraction of a second, like she'd been daring me to notice her, then darted away, guarding herself again. I didn't say anything. I just watched her straighten, smooth her coat, tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The energy between us had shifted, quiet, tense, charged. Not words, not touch, not even a confession. Just the gentle pull of something forbidden, something unspoken, hanging in the tiny space where our hands had almost met. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, the shop was empty except for us, the soft hum of the overhead lights filling the space like a heartbeat. Outside, rain tapped rhythmically against the windows, the kind of steady, persistent drizzle that makes everything feel smaller, closer. She was perched on the edge of the counter, coat draped over her shoulders, and I couldn't tell if she was tired, waiting, or testing me. I kept my hands busy with a screwdriver, though I could feel her gaze on me in ways that made my chest tight. We didn't need to talk, just the shared silence, the occasional brush of our elbows, the way her hand rested near mine on the radio, was enough. "You always fix things," she said quietly, almost like an observation rather than a question. "Not always," I murmured. "Just things people don't notice." Her laugh was soft, almost swallowed by the storm outside. I wanted to lean in, to tell her she didn't have to hide behind her careful distance, that she could let someone see the cracks. But the moment stretched out, fragile, waiting to be broken. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, frowned, and whispered, "It's nothing," before silencing it. I didn't ask, didn't need to. Whatever it was, it added a subtle weight to the air, like the storm itself had pressed a hand onto her shoulder. We leaned over the radio together, trying to trace a wiring problem. Her hand brushed mine again, this time longer, and my pulse jumped. I could feel her tension, the way she held back, hesitant but curious. I wanted to close the distance, wanted to say the words I'd been holding back, but something, restraint, respect, fear, kept me from moving. You don't have to explain everything," I said softly, not sure if I meant the radio, or the silence, or the phone. She looked up, eyes locking with mine for the briefest second, and I almost lost myself in them. Outside, the rain intensified, the sound drumming against the metal roof. I could almost imagine the shop closing in around us, the world narrowing to this one small corner where we existed together, just barely. She shifted, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, and in that motion, the air between us seemed to hum. I could feel the pull, the almost but not quite, the tiny space where something could have happened if only we'd dared. I swallowed hard. My hands tightened on the tool, but I didn't let them move. A car pulled up outside, the headlights slicing through the rain, sharp and intrusive. She stiffened, straightened, and that invisible barrier returned. The moment broke, delicate and fleeting, like a bubble popping in slow motion. I stepped back, pretending to examine the radio from a different angle, but my heart hadn't moved. I could still feel the warmth of her hand near mine, the tension lingering like a whispered question neither of us could answer. And yet, even as she gathered her things and headed toward the door, I caught the faintest flicker, an almost glance, almost touch, almost admission, that left me frozen long after she'd gone. The storm raged on outside, but inside, something heavier than weather had taken hold, and I couldn't stop thinking about the almost we'd almost allowed ourselves. It was quieter than usual in the shop that evening. The storm had passed, leaving a damp, metallic smell hanging in the air. I was sitting on the edge of a workbench, hands still greasy from hours of tinkering, when she leaned against the opposite counter, arms folded, eyes fixed on some distant point I couldn't see. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Just the faint tick of the wall clock, the occasional drip of water from the leaky roof. I wanted to break it, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, she sighed, soft and deliberate, like the sound carried the weight of something she'd been holding for a long time. What are we doing?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the stillness sharper than any shout. I blinked. That question, the way she said it. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't flirtatious. It was raw, confusing, almost painful in its honesty. I opened my mouth, then closed it. There was no simple answer. "I don't know," I admitted finally, my own voice sounding foreign in my ears. I thought we were just here. Like this." She shook her head slowly, her gaze dropping to her hands. She traced invisible patterns on the counter, fingers curling and uncurling as if she were trying to untangle something inside herself. "It feels like we're pretending, like we're something else, but we're not allowed to be." I wanted to tell her it was okay, that we didn't have to label it, but the words felt hollow. Instead, I just watched her, the way her shoulders slumped, the tension in her jaw, the faint tremor in her hands. Every small detail screamed more than any confession could. The air between us grew thick, heavy with unsaid things. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume lingering even though she hadn't moved closer. I noticed the way her eyes, though she kept them downcast, flicked up to mine every few seconds, searching, testing. "I can't," she started, then stopped, swallowed the rest of the sentence. My chest tightened at the hesitation, the refusal to finish, the vulnerability she couldn't, or wouldn't, let out. I wanted to reach across the counter, to close the space, to somehow make it easier, but I didn't. We were both standing on opposite sides of something we couldn't name, and touching it might shatter it completely. Finally, she let out another soft breath, more like a confession to herself than to me. Maybe we should just stop pretending I don't notice." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I was too aware of every small movement, every almost smile, every half-hidden sigh. She turned, coat brushing the floor, and for a brief, infinitesimal second, I thought she might say more, might lean in, might risk it all. But instead, she stopped at the door, hand on the handle, eyes meeting mine one last time. "I'm tired," she whispered, almost breaking, and then she was gone. The room felt impossibly empty, though the air still carried her presence. And I realized, with a sinking certainty, that I couldn't stop thinking about that single line. The raw honesty that left me trembling and more aware of her than ever. The next afternoon, she showed up unannounced, holding a worn envelope in her hand. She didn't say hello, didn't smile. She just leaned against the counter, fingers tracing the edges like she was afraid it might tear. "I found this," she said finally, voice quiet, almost fragile. "It's from him." I froze. Didn't know what to say. The him wasn't important yet. It wasn't about jealousy, not exactly. It was the way she said it, the weight in her chest, the tremor in her hands. She held the envelope like it carried a part of her she couldn't let go of, and suddenly the shop felt impossibly small. "Do you want me to look?" I asked, though I had no right to, though I wasn't sure I wanted to. She shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "No, I just needed to touch it, to feel that it's real, that he was real, that I'm not making it up." Her eyes flicked up at mine for a second, and I saw it. The raw vulnerability she usually kept buried. The exhaustion, the lingering grief, the way she had built walls around herself. And now, for one quiet moment, they were cracking. I wanted to reach out, to tell her she didn't have to carry it alone, but I didn't. Instead, I just watched her. Every detail became amplified. The slight tremble in her lips, the curve of her hands as she clutched the envelope, the way her shoulders rounded as if bracing herself against a memory that hurt. "You loved him," I said finally, softly. Not a question, just a statement. She laughed, but it was hollow, a sound that almost didn't exist. "Loved maybe. Or maybe I just lost him first, in the end. Doesn't matter. He's gone." Her eyes wandered to the floor, and I noticed how she hesitated before looking back at me, like she wasn't sure if she could trust anyone to really see it. The grief, the guilt, the heartbreak she carried like an invisible weight. I wanted to say something clever, comforting, something that would erase the ache I saw in her, but no word seemed adequate. All I could do was sit quietly, letting the silence stretch, letting her reveal the truth in the smallest of gestures. And then, almost without thinking, I reached over and touched her hand. Just lightly. A brush, nothing more, but it was enough to make her flinch, to make the envelope tremble slightly under her fingers. She didn't pull away immediately. She let it linger. Just a second. Enough to send a ripple through both of us. Enough for her to realize that someone else noticed her pain, that someone else could hold it without judging, without asking for explanations. "I forgot how heavy it feels," she whispered, almost to herself, almost too soft for me to hear. Her voice hung in the space between us like smoke. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. And in that quiet, suspended moment, I realized that everything had shifted. The unspoken, the tension, the fragile connection we'd been dancing around. All of it had moved somewhere deeper, somewhere no envelope or storm could reach. And for the first time, I wasn't sure who would carry the weight of it afterward, or if either of us would ever be the same. It was late again, and the shop smelled of oil and rain. I was sitting on a low stool, sorting through a pile of small parts, when she appeared in the doorway. No announcement, no hesitation. Just her, framed by the dim light, and something in her eyes that made me stop what I was doing. We didn't speak at first. The silence had become easier between us, heavier with unspoken truths, but lighter in a way that felt like permission. She came closer, coat damp, hair slightly mussed, and sat on the counter, letting her feet dangle. "You didn't leave," she said softly, more observation than question. "I didn't see a reason to," I replied, though my voice cracked slightly, betraying more than I intended. She watched me for a moment, expression unreadable. Then, finally, she reached over and picked up a small, greasy gear I had been examining. Her fingers brushed mine as she passed it back, and I felt that familiar, impossible electricity, the one that had been threading through all our encounters, now settled somewhere warmer, steadier. I don't know," she began, hesitated, and then sighed. "Maybe this, whatever this is, doesn't have to be complicated. We don't need words for it." I swallowed hard, because I felt the same, had felt it all along. Every glance, every brush of fingers, every stormy night and half-confession had been pointing here, toward this quiet inevitability. I nodded, letting her observation stand as agreement. The relief in her posture, the tiny exhale she released, made the space between us feel smaller, softer. We stayed like that for a long time, just sharing the room. I noticed the way her shoulders slumped slightly when she relaxed, the way her eyes softened when she wasn't guarding herself, the faint tremor in her hands fading into calm. Without thinking, I leaned slightly forward, resting the back of my hand lightly against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let it stay, fingertips brushing lightly over mine. It was neither a gesture nor a promise, just acknowledgment. Just the truth of what had been simmering for weeks. Unspoken but undeniable. For a moment, I closed my eyes, letting the quiet wrap around us. The rain outside had stopped. The shop felt like the only place in the world that mattered, and somehow, that was enough. She laughed quietly at something I didn't catch, a soft sound that made my chest tighten in a familiar, unexplainable way. I smiled without meaning to, just letting it happen, letting it be. Then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned forward, forehead brushing mine. The contact was brief, light, but it carried everything we hadn't said: the exhaustion, the tension, the longing, the comfort, the inevitability. We stayed like that, side by side, hands touching lightly, sharing the silence, letting it say what words could not. And I realized, finally, that nothing else needed to be said. The quiet had spoken, the truth had settled, and somehow, without any grand declarations or dramatic moments, it was enough. We were here, together, and that alone carried more meaning than anything else could. It's strange how some moments settle into you, quiet and persistent, long after the noise of the world moves on. Sitting here now, years later, I can still remember the smell of the shop after a rainstorm, the faint coffee stain on the counter, and the subtle brush of her fingers that changed everything without a word. She was never just someone older, someone confident, someone untouchable. She was someone who taught me, without lectures or explanations, that love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it comes softly, almost invisibly, in shared silences, in small touches, in the way someone trusts you with their unspoken burdens. I've thought a lot about what shifted between us. It wasn't a grand confession or a dramatic gesture. It was the acknowledgment, finally, that we had been moving toward each other all along. The late nights, the storms, the hesitant touches, the awkward silences, they were all parts of the same truth, one that neither of us could fully name, but both of us understood. And she changed too. I can see now, looking back, the way she allowed herself to be vulnerable, just a little, and how it shaped everything about her confidence. Strength doesn't have to be armor. Trust doesn't have to be loud. There's a kind of courage in simply letting someone in letting them see the cracks without fear that the world will collapse. I've learned that love isn't about age or timing or perfect moments. It's about presence, about choosing the small, intentional gestures that say, without words, I see you. I notice you. I'm here. It's about holding space for someone else and letting them hold space for you. And somehow, in that quiet reciprocity, everything else falls into place. I think about her sometimes, her hands, her laugh, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking too hard, and I smile. Not because it's romantic in the movies, not because there's a dramatic finale, but because it's real. Because it was ours, in all its flawed, human, delicate intensity. Some stories end with fireworks. Ours ended with stillness. But sometimes stillness is enough. Sometimes it carries more weight than any shouted promise ever could. I can close my eyes and feel that calm, that quiet certainty, and know that what we had was rare, and that it left us both changed, both awake to what love can be when it's patient, when it's honest, when it's earned. And now, even as I remember, even as the world moves on around me, I smile again, quietly. Because it's still ours. Because it still matters. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?